Good evening. Thank you for coming to our forum on impeachment. My name is Adam Hoffman, and I'm professor and chair of the Political Science Department at SU. And welcome to the forum, Impeaching a President, Challenges of Democracy. Tonight we look at one of the most important and conflictual functions of government, namely the process of one branch of government checking and curbing what they believe is the undemocratic and unconstitutional abuse of power by another branch. In what's become a popular story about the Constitutional Convention, as Ben Franklin was leaving the Philadelphia Hall, a woman yelled out to him, "Dr. Franklin, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic?" To which Franklin replied, "A republic, if you could keep it." As we go through this impeachment process with the Democrats in the House seeking to impeach a Republican president, and the public seemingly divided on who or what to believe, Franklin's warning is still quite relevant, as the country, the politicians, the people, the media are definitely being tested to see if we could truly keep the republic. Tonight, we have the pleasure of some of our most knowledgeable speakers from our own political science department. First, Dr. O'Loughlin will speak on the philosophical and constitutional basis for Congress's impeachment power. Then I will focus on the current Ukraine situation and the hearings that are going on currently in the House of Representatives. Following, Dr. Surak will speak about the role of dissent and the protection for whistleblowers in federal administrations. Then, placing the Trump impeachment in a comparative context, Dr. Nam will speak on the political consequences of impeaching a president in South Korea. And then finally, Dr. Rittinger will look at interrupted presidencies in Latin America, highlighting the differences between an impeachment and a coup. So we'll all speak for a few minutes, and then when we're finished speaking, then we'd love to take your questions and answers. So perhaps as Dr. Rittinger is finishing up, you could line up at these two microphones to ask us questions. And with that, Dr. O'Loughlin.
In the song Badlands, Bruce Springsteen writes, "Poor man wanna be rich man wanna be king, and a king ain't satisfied till he rules everything." This sums up well the character of the imperial presidency under the reign of the would-be King Trump. Speaking at a conference recently, Trump gave us his interpretation of constitutional presidential power when he boasted, quote, "I have an Article 2 power where I have the right to do whatever I want as president." In dramatic contrast, we have Maryland's own Congressman Jamie Raskin stating, quote, "Congress was never designed as, nor should it ever become a mere co-equal branch, beseeching the president to share his awesome powers with us. We are the exclusive lawmaking branch of our national government and the preeminent part of it. We set the policy agenda, we write the laws, and we can impeach judges or executives who commit high crimes and misdemeanors against our institutions." Who's right? Which interpretation of the Constitution is correct? The answer is found in the clear text of the Constitution and in arguments made by the framers of the Constitution exhibited in the Federalist Papers of 1788, particularly as they reflect on the issue at hand, impeachment of a president. A brief review of these two sources affirms that Raskin is right and Trump is wrong. Raskin's view rests on the proposition that the Congress was intended to be the central, legitimate source of policymaking power in the federal government. The Constitution begins with Article 1, establishing the legislative policymaking authority in the Congress, not the president, not the bureaucracy, and not the federal courts, including the Supreme Court. In effect, the latter institutions were to be subordinate to the law of the land as established by the U.S. Congress. Hence, Article 1 identifies a long list of powers granted to the Congress, explicit powers such as the power to tax, to borrow money, to regulate commerce, to raise an army, etc., all constitutionally based authorities. Nonetheless, Separation of powers is also a principle of U.S. national government, meaning a measure of independent authority and power is also established in the other institutions. Yet, still in all, as if to maintain the dominance of the Congress, the framers sought to ensure that the Congress, could check and override the actions of other branches and their occupants through legislative action, but also through the blunt instrument of physical removal from office. This is impeachment. Complex though it is, the power involves a process of investigation and inquiry, the bringing of charges and the holding of a trial leading to a possible conviction and expulsion. Specifically, as spelled out in Article 1, Section 2, the Constitution says, the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. Article 1, Section 3 then continues, the Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. Importantly, the supremacy of the legislature is apparent in the framers' arguments for this impeachment power. As Alexander Hamilton writes in the Federalist Papers, it is not disputed that the power of originating the inquiry, or in other words, of preferring the impeachment, ought to be lodged in the hands of one branch of the legislative body, end quote. As constitutional scholars have noted, this claim is anchored in the shared sentiment among most of the framers to avoid the creation of a new monarchy and protect its evolution in favor of securing a republic, a polity within a collective representative power would reign. But what should be the criteria for judgment for either the House or the Senate? Again, the Constitution gives guidance when it says, quote, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The meaning of treason and bribery are relatively self-evident, but to what misconduct does the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors refer? Cass Sunstein, a noted professor of law, suggests an answer, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors was the substitute term for maladministration, which covered great and dangerous offenses outside of treason and bribery. History suggests that it means very egregious abuses of authority. That's what the American and English practice points to, end quote. In this light, we understand this constitutional criteria best as a political rather than a legal standard. I say political in its most moral sense, having to do with serving the public good and upholding the purpose of the office to serve the common interest in some fundamental sense. Most importantly, the constitutional directive here includes actions and behaviors that are judged to be a betrayal of the public interest and associated public trust through abuse of Article 2 presidential powers, even if, and this is important, even if no violation of statutory law has occurred. In other words, the Constitution gives the Congress wide discretion in its use of impeachment power, specific violation of code law, and unnecessary precondition. The distinction between violating a political norm and violating a legal norm, that is, official law of the state, is revealed as well indirectly in the same section of the Constitution. Quote, judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. Banishment from any office of honor, trust, or profit in the United States is the goal. The conviction of a crime under a law, a secondary matter, though liability for indictment after expulsion remains open. This understanding is consistent with the original intentions of the framers of the Constitution. We can see this reasoning as part of Hamilton's argument in defense of the Senate as what he called a court of impeachments. In Federalist Paper number 65, Hamilton writes, the subjects of the Senate's jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or, in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself, end quote. Hints of Aristotle, Locke, and Rousseau are evident here with their use of the term political to refer to the public arena where the good of society is served in some fashion rather than our contemporary use of the term to refer to corrupt partisan politics. In any case, the congressional authority of impeachment and expulsion has great breadth, extending beyond narrow legal bounds. Constitutionally, Congress has the right and indeed the obligation to impeach and expel rogue presidents from office who have abused their powers of office. Yet, it is evident that Congress today struggles for supremacy or even equality in its relationship to this president. This is revealed in the present set of circumstances. Given the Mueller report's damning evidence against President Trump related to Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election and the damning evidence of abuse of power and bribery in the Ukraine affair, why is President Trump still in office? The answer? The Republican Party and its control of the United States Senate. Heavily influenced by the donor class, the wealthy elite of this country, the Senate Republicans refuse to exercise their constitutional responsibility for accountability of a president and the power of the Congress to reign supreme. The political problem we face is a deeper malignancy on our democracy. Aside from Trump, we face a major political party whose elites prefer to retain power and pursue their wealth agenda at the cost of accepting corruption, and on the congressional side, undermining Congress's own legitimacy as the first branch of government. In this respect, Mitch McConnell and the Republican leadership in the Senate are particularly guilty. Far from being an institutionalist protecting the power of the Congress, McConnell exhibits an interest principally in maintaining partisan power to the benefit of his donor base and to corporate power. Alexander Hamilton, a key framer of the Constitution, anticipated this problem. Again, I quote from Federalist 65, this is Hamilton, quote, "In many cases, impeachment will connect itself with the pre-existing factions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence, and interest on one side or on the other. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt," end quote. Applying Hamilton's reasoning to the present circumstances, we can see that while the Democratic House is ready to impeach this president and expel him from office for good reason, the Republican-controlled Senate resists. The real demonstrations of innocence or guilt, amply revealed in the Mueller report and further exhibited in the Ukraine affair, convict this president. But the comparative strength of parties, using Hamilton's words, favors the Republicans in the Senate, which is the critical body for expulsion from office. Even if the House of Representatives votes in favor of articles of impeachment, the Senate majority is unlikely to convict and remove Trump from office. This set of circumstances reveals the structural weakness in the power of impeachment, the bicameral arrangement of the Congress of the United States. The authority to impeach and to expel is divided between the two branches of the legislature rather than consolidated in one. Hamilton articulates a rationale for this division, but naively believes that the Senate's composition and independence would lead it to rise above partisan and special interest influence. As he argues, where else than in the Senate could have been found a tribunal sufficiently dignified or sufficiently independent? What other body would be likely to feel the confidence enough in its own situation to preserve, unawed and uninfluenced, the necessary impartiality between an individual accused and the representatives of the people, his accusers, end quote. Plainly, Hamilton and his colleagues believed that the Senate, the repository of elite property gentlemen selected by state legislatures, would have independence from both the wealthy class insistent only on its expansion of wealth and power and an underclass racist and authoritarian in orientation supportive of authoritarian rule. Instead, today's Republican senators are awed and influenced by Trump's hold on a reactionary base of voters and a wealthy donor base who value wealth protection and expansion over the rule of law, human rights, and civility. Consequently, they are servile to those political pressures and have rejected the necessary impartiality to judge innocence or guilt. Clearly, Hamilton and the other framers were wrong. The structure and process of impeachment also reveals the elitism and ultimately the anti-democratic mindset of the framers. As with the Electoral College, they hobbled true democratic government with checks. In effect, elite veto power in both the election of presidents and the power of the People's House, the House of Representatives, to keep presidents in check. We must remember that the original constitutional structure before the 17th Amendment had state legislatures electing the Senate. This was perceived as ensuring that wise men would, if necessary, override the potential irrationality of the rabble that might get control of the House. In effect, what they gave with one hand, they took away with the other. They placed great authority in the House to impeach, but then checked that power with the necessity of a trial in the Senate, a body they believed would be more assuredly populated by men of property, elites who would be the wiser. The logic of the creation of the Electoral College was similar. We now, in the 21st century, remain confronted with both the undemocratic results of the Electoral College system and the paralysis of the impeachment system as well, created by 18th century politicians. Ironically, while the framers believed in the 18th century that they were building a constitutional framework for a republic where the legislature would reign supreme, instead, they created a framework that would enable the emergence in the 21st century of an imperial, predatory, and corrupt presidency, Exhibit A, Donald Trump.
So just to sort of take us through what's currently going on in Congress, in the House, it's pretty complicated. And I think I was looking today at polls of the percentage of people who are watching some of the hearings, part of the hearings, tuning in now and then to try to figure out and follow what's going on. So in my short presentation, I hope to sort of help you understand what's been going on currently in the House of Representatives. So just to put it in a little context, in 2014, Russia invades Ukraine and annexes part of their country known as Crimea. Between that time and currently, the U.S. provides about $1.5 billion in military support to help the Ukrainians fight against the Russians. So the case so far, Dr. O'Loughlin spoke a little bit about it, but just to sort of drill down into the specifics of what the Democrats are sort of focusing on in the House with these soon-to-be-drawn articles of impeachment. The president, his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and 2 diplomats are alleged to have collaborated to pressure Ukraine to pursue investigations to bolster Trump's conspiracy theories about the 2016 election and damage the prospects of his potential opponent, Joe Biden, in next year's election. To advance this agenda, Trump and his allies have orchestrated a number of things, including the ouster of the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine, the withholding of an Oval Office meeting with Ukraine's new president, and the suspension of hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. aid that has been appropriated by the Congress. Dozens of senior officials, including the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, acting White House Chief of Staff, and others were either aware or involved in this Ukraine scheme and failed to expose or stop it. More than half a dozen lower-ranking officials made futile attempts to intervene. Just to take us through a little bit on the actual process of impeaching a president. So right now, they're sort of where you see the second horizontal arrow pointing. It starts in the House of Representatives. Any member of the House could introduce impeachment resolution. Right now, the House Intelligence Committee, as many of you know, being chaired by Adam Schiff, is holding hearings that started last week on the 13th. Once those hearings finish, which I think will be probably next week, then it moves to the House Judiciary Committee, where they analyze the accusations and all the testimony that has taken place in the House Intelligence Committee. Following that, it goes to the floor. Articles of impeachment are drawn up. It goes to the entire floor of the House, and all members of the House get the opportunity to vote on articles of impeachment. In order for that to be successful, all they need is a simple majority, 51%, or 218 House members. So as you can see, the current partisan makeup of the House makes it a fairly easy task for Democrats to get that vote, while even some Democrats could vote against it and they would still have 218. Assuming that happens, and it probably will, then of course, as you know, it moves to the Senate. The Senate acts as the trial, basically, acts as the body that convicts the president, but only if they get, if you move all the way up the top, only if they get a supermajority of 67 votes. After having a trial presided over by the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, once the trial is finished, eventually there will be a vote in the Senate, probably after, probably at the beginning of the new year. And as you can see, it's much more difficult for the Democrats to succeed there. Republicans are clearly favored to not be able to vote for the conviction of Donald Trump for impeachment due to the numbers. So just to sort of set up a little bit the current Congress. All right, players. A lot of people are involved, right? Zelensky, he's the Ukrainian actor and comedian who was elected president of the Ukraine in May of 2019. Hunter Biden, of course, served on the board of Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company. The company, for a long time, had faced allegations of corruption, was investigated in 2014. That didn't involve Hunter Biden. U.S. State Department indicated that there was no conflict of interest with Hunter Biden serving on the board of Burisma. Then we have Rudy, former mayor of New York City, Trump's personal attorney, and basically he's a central figure here leading Trump's effort to use the new Ukrainian government in order to get dirt on Joe Biden. Lev and Igor, two of my favorite characters, work for Giuliani and charged with planning to direct funds from a foreign government, so they've been arrested while trying to leave the U.S. You have Lutsenko, who was an ex-prosecutor of Ukraine and jailed for corruption. He's been working closely with Giuliani to feed Giuliani and other sympathetic people with false claims, also to the U.S. media, and also to Trump about the Bidens, about the ambassador, and about this made-up story of Ukrainian interference in 2016 elections. Kurt Volker, special representative for Ukraine negotiations, I believe he testified just today. Then, of course, the star, the whistleblower, an anonymous government worker, probably a CIA analyst with access to White House officials. And this person filed an official complaint against the president, claiming that multiple officials had concerns that Trump was using his public office to seek political personal gain from a foreign power, not just through the famous or now infamous July 25th phone conversation with Zelensky, but through emissaries including Giuliani and possibly Bill Barr and other people. Over the past few months, allegations have been made that document the overwhelmingly substantiated by the sworn testimony of various officials and even the inadvertent admission of Trump's chief of staff, most importantly with the president's own words captured on the July 25th phone call and probably a number of tweets. Another key figure who will be testifying tomorrow is Gordon Sunland. He's the EU ambassador, a mega donor to Trump's campaign, was appointed to EU ambassador, and for some reason, even though Ukraine isn't in the EU, sort of took the lead in this sort of alternative Ukraine policy as orchestrated mainly by, like I said, Rudy Giuliani. Rick Perry will enter into this soap opera soon. William Taylor, the chargé d'affaires for the U.S. Embassy of Ukraine, involved in talks between Volker, Sunland, and Zelensky, and he testified last week about his recollection of Trump basically trying to bribe Ukraine to find out dirt on Joe Biden. And then another central figure who testified last week, Marie Yovanovitch, was ambassador to Ukraine, served in the Foreign Service for 33 years, but was forced out by Trump and others. So, as I said, we have to go back really to the beginning of the year when Giuliani meets with Lysenko in New York, and they begin discussing a number of these rumors, conspiracy theories. Also, Giuliani's trying to smooth the way for the possible gas deal with Ukraine. In the process, they're digging up they're trying to dig up derogatory information on the former vice president and Hunter Biden. They're kind of starting this disinformation campaign about the ambassador Yovanovitch, who ironically was trying to fight the actual corruption that was occurring in the Ukraine. They started a rumor that she was bad-mouthing the president, that she was an ever-Trumper, and that she was refusing to look at the corruption specifically as it affected the Bidens. And they also were sort of helping gin up the story about how it was the Ukrainians and not the Russians who interfered in the 2016 election, and that the Ukrainians favored Clinton, not Trump. Trump had been pushing this story for a long time, as had Vladimir Putin. Giuliani also suggested that Lysenko get in touch with our U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr. So over the next few months, Giuliani sort of continues to be a conduit for these stories about Ukraine as they make their way to right-wing media outlets, Don Jr.'s tweeting, and to President Trump. Around the same time, NSA advisor John Bolton and National NSC advisor Fiona Hill try unsuccessfully to sort of wrest control of this sort of rogue Ukrainian policy away from Giuliani and Sunland, the so-called irregular channel of this, money for dirt. Let's see. So for the next, so April 21st is when Zelensky has his presidential inauguration, and that becomes important in a moment. For the next few months, using WhatsApp, Sunland texts back and forth with Zelensky aides, sort of pushing this ask of Zelensky to, find some dirt on the Bidens. May 13th, Rick Perry is sent to represent the U.S. at Zelensky's inauguration. He gets the new Ukrainian government to provide a sweetheart energy deal for one of his donors. A few weeks after the whistleblower complaint comes out, Perry resigns. Finally, we're at the famous or infamous phone call, July 25th, between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. So based on the White House edited transcript, Trump's own comments, whistleblower complaint, the testimony that we heard today from Vindman, as well as a number of other officials, Zelensky in the phone call said we are ready to cooperate for the next steps. Specifically, we're almost ready to buy more javelins from the United States for defensive purposes. I mean, clearly the Ukrainians are in a bind here against a much more powerful army, which is why they're so reliant on U.S. Military aid. And Trump, of course, replies, I would like you to do us a favor, though, right? Trump pressures Zelensky to continue or start an investigation into the activities of Joe Biden and his son, Hunter Biden, to investigate whether it was Ukraine and not Russia that interfered in the election, and that he needed to do this in order to get the $400 million that was previously authorized by Congress. Trump praises the corrupt Lysenko and badmouths his own U.S. ambassador, saying she's going to go through some things. Then the White House tries to cover this up by removing word-for-word transcript of the call from the usual computer storage system. Instead, they place it on a separate computer system reserved for highly sensitive information. Vindman, who was on the call, testified that Trump's request to Zelensky to investigate the Bidens really seemed like an order, as he said in today's testimony. Follow this, the day after this call, Gordon Sunland is at a restaurant, and Sunland is with David Holmes, another State Department official, and he tells Holmes he's going to call Trump to give him an update on how this request is going. Holmes hears Trump loudly through Sunland's cell phone, asking him how the Ukrainians are doing on the investigation. Sunland says, Zelensky loves your ass. Trump says, so, is he going to do the investigation? Sunland replies, he's going to do it. President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do. Sunland also updates Trump on the important matters like his inability to free rapper A$AP Rocky as a favor that Trump wanted to do for the Kardashians. That was really important. So the other thing, I think it just came out that also Russians were listening to these phone calls on Sunland's unsecured cell phone, which is pretty easy to do because, as I understand, the Russians own the phone lines in Ukraine. So I don't think that's a difficult thing for them to do. Anyway, Holmes asked the ambassador, Sunland, he said, is it true that the president does not give a shit about Ukraine? And Sunland agreed that the president does not give a shit about Ukraine. And I asked why not. This is Holmes speaking. And Sunland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. Holmes said, I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sunland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Giuliani was pushing. So it'll be really interesting to see in tomorrow's testimony if Sunland confirms what Holmes was saying in his testimony. August 3rd, Trump's threat to cut off $400 to Ukraine gets real as career budget officials raise concern about signing these documents, believing that it may run afoul of the law, especially if Congress has approved it. But the White House basically shifts authority at the OMB to a former Wisconsin GOP a political appointee, Michael Duffy, who ends up signing off on the freezing of the Ukrainian aid. Let's see. I'm running over. I'm going to skip over Volker. I'm going to go to August 12th. Of course, that's when the whistleblower ultimately filed the complaint with the Intelligence Community's Inspector General, Michael Atkinson. August 22nd, after the whistleblower complaint came out and the media really started to report on this, I guess Politico broke the story the 28th. Right before that, the Trump administration abandoned its effort to slash foreign assistance. I believe they released the aid. It remains suspended, though, until September 11th when it's to be released. Over the next couple of months, the House gets involved. Congress gets involved. 3 U.S. House committees launch a probe into the Trump and Giuliani campaign. Bolton steps down as National Security Advisor. Bolton says he resigns. Trump says he fires him. September 11th, Trump finally releases the hold on U.S. assistance to the Ukraine. The 22nd, after spending a few weeks talking about the perfect phone call in Trump's words, he basically says that there was nothing inappropriate about it, but Trump does acknowledge discussing Joe Biden with the Ukrainian leader during the phone call. Let's see. All right, just a couple more things. So last week's testimony was quite interesting and telling. Taylor and Kent testified, and they described a month-long effort by the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and other diplomats that placed the foreign policy objectives that they had in the State Department in jeopardy. Both said they eventually came to believe that the release of crucial military aid, this $400 million, was in fact contingent on Ukraine announcing that they would be investigating Ukrainian interference in 2016 elections and Burisma, and of course Hunter Biden, the former vice president's son. They were now peddling false information in order to exact revenge against those who had exposed their misconduct, including U.S. diplomats, Ukrainian real anti-corruption officials, reform-minded civil society groups in the Ukraine. This is testimony from Kent. In mid-August, it became clear to me, Ken said, that Giuliani's effort to gin up politically motivated investigations were now infecting U.S. engagement with the Ukraine. Taylor said that these irregular foreign policies included Giuliani as well as Trump's acting chief of staff, Mulvaney, Energy Secretary Rick Perry, former Ukraine envoy Kurt Volker, and Sunland, who we spoke about. The ambassador testified to last week. Formerly, she was the most senior member of the U.S. diplomatic corps in Europe, widely respected figure within the State Department, but she became a casualty of Giuliani's pressure campaign in the Ukraine. She was the target of allegations, which have been unsubstantiated, that she tried to protect Americans in the Ukraine by giving Ukrainians a do not prosecute list. The list was fake, and it was corrupt Ukrainians threatened by her anti-corruption efforts who really wanted her to leave. Lysenko and other corrupt Ukrainian officials worked with Giuliani to smear her. The smears, as I said, spread around the blogosphere, made their way up to Trump. In April, Yovanovitch ended up getting a late-night call from the State Department saying she needed to leave immediately due to security reasons. Ironically, it was the same day that she was honoring a friend who had died a horrific death after an acid attack for trying to root out corruption in the Ukraine. During her hearing, of course, famously tweeted more insults as she was testifying before Congress, leading Democrats to likely add witness tampering to the articles of impeachment, as the real-time tweets, at least Trump was probably hoping, would intimidate other witnesses from coming forward. As I said, just lastly, sort of keep your eyes open for Gordon Sondland's testimony tomorrow. Tim Morrison, the top Russia and European advisor on the NSC, testified that during these important months, he understood that Sunland had spoken to Trump about half a dozen times, linking, what Sunland and Giuliani was doing directly to Trump. Well, Trump still said he doesn't know Sunland, tried to distance himself from the EU ambassador. Anyway, that's the story so far. Let me turn it over to Dr. Surak.
Thank you. Tonight, I will speak briefly to the catalyst of these impeachment discussions, whistleblowing. While some political commentators have argued that a focus on whether the whistleblower deserves anonymity is a procedural distraction that obscures the substance of the impeachment investigations, I'm very concerned that failing to provide provide the protection of anonymity to the whistleblower will impact the willingness and ability of federal employees to speak out in the future when they believe that they have knowledge of, quote, a serious or flagrant problem, abuse, or violation of the law or executive order. That is in the words of the whistleblower's 7-page report that was submitted. I'll begin tonight by providing a brief background about the history of whistleblowing in the U.S. context. I'll provide a few current updates and a bit of an overview of protections that whistleblowers face today. And I'll argue that while the president and other elected and appointed officials are calling for the name of the whistleblower to be released, that their identity should be protected. First, a bit of history. While we tend to think about whistleblowing as a modern phenomena, you might think of Daniel Ellsberg leaking the Pentagon Papers, or Mike Felt with the Watergate informant. Whistleblowing is not a new feature of our governance practices, but rather woven into the civil society of the United States since its founding. Whistleblower protections are as old as our struggle for independence. The first instance of whistleblowing occurred on March 25, 1777, when Marine Captain John Grannis reported to the Continental Congress that he and 9 other men witnessed the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Navy, Esek Hopkins, treating British prisoners inhumanely. Hopkins was removed from his post, and when he tried to retaliate against the whistleblowers, the Continental Congress intervened. As a result, on July 30th, 1778, the Congress passed legislation stating that those serving the United States had, quote, the duty to tell Congress as soon as possible about any misconduct, fraud, or misdemeanors committed by others while in government service. The federal government's involvement in whistleblower protections further grew during the Civil War with the passage of the 1863 False Claims Act that established an incentive for whistleblowers to report contractors who cheated the federal government. They'd receive about 50% of the fine, so there was like a benefit of doing this for reporting. The False Claim Act remains in use today. The most recent substantive overhaul was in 1986, which included the raising of penalties up to $10,000. Outlining a much longer history than I can outline tonight, Allison Stanger has a great book out if you want to think about these whistleblowing more broadly, called Whistleblowing, Honesty in America from Washington to Trump. And in there she states that whistleblowing is, quote, in our DNA. In fact, the US has led the world on whistleblowing protections, and many states model our policies in their own for whistleblowing. Federal employees reporting whistleblowing today must work through the designated mechanisms depending on their position. Whistleblowing in the intelligence community is different from other types of whistleblowing, like corporate malfeasance or those for other domestic matters. For those in the intelligence industry, for those in the intelligence community, protections and procedures are outlined in the 1998 Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act. That's kind of a mouthful, the ICWPA. The whistleblower that filed the report with the intelligence community, with the coverage of the ICWPA, acted as they were supposed to. So they followed all of the laws that they needed to do in order to report the whistleblowing, or in order to make their report. The main body of the letter is now publicly available. I imagine many people in the room have read it and outlined it, or read it online as it was released. In the letter, the whistleblower is careful to relay that they were not, quote, the direct witness to most of the events described, and yet they found the accounts to be credible as, quote, in almost all cases, multiple officials recounted fact patterns that were consistent with one another. The contents of the letter are now well known. Dr. Hoffman mentioned them. It begins with the outlining of the whistleblower's concern with the content of the July 25th phone call between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. The letter goes on beyond that, laying out the concerns of the July phone call by describing a larger pattern of behavior that occurred over 4 months in an attempt to spark an investigation of Joe and Hunter Biden. In doing so, the whistleblower provides a roadmap for the investigation for Congress to determine if the allegations are true and then what to do with them. So in particular, in the 7-page document, you have laid out a comprehensive argument. It's not simply talking about a phone call, it's talking about people that are involved that can be brought in to testify in Congress. Names of people, names of computer systems, and where documents were moved. It's a literal roadmap for Congress to think about as it moves forward discussing what to do with this matter. To date, much of the letter has been corroborated by the news media and thus far in congressional reporting. If this is the case, then why is the identity of the whistleblower a concern? According to the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, the Inspector General should not disclose the whistleblower's identity without their consent unless it's determined that it's unavoidable to do so within the context of the investigation. But the letter is now out of the hands of the IG and with the Congress, and the law doesn't guarantee any other further anonymity to the whistleblower. In 2014, a law supplementing the ICWPA does protect, that was a law that was passed in 2014, does protect whistleblowers from retaliation from colleagues and supervisors, so within their job. So it basically protects them from termination and from the loss of their security clearance. This is really important, especially the security clearance loss protection, because if you lose your security clearance, you're unable to continue to work in the intelligence industry, and if this is your occupation, then you're unable to keep performing your occupation to any sort of real capacity. So whistleblowers are protected in that case that are within the intelligence industry. But the law is limited in that it allows a person to remain anonymous, but at the same time, it's not a crime to reveal the name of the whistleblower unless they're a covert agent. There could be repercussions or censure for those who do reveal a name, though, so it's not that you would necessarily be able to. Congress, for example, could take action if a member of Congress was to reveal a name by removing a congressperson from their committee or providing other sorts of sanctions or whatnot. But technically, it's not illegal. The whistleblower most definitely would prefer to remain anonymous. The whistleblower's legal team has sent a cease and desist letter to the White House requesting that the president stop calling for the whistleblower to be publicly revealed over concerns for the safety of the whistleblower. Trump has called for the revealing of the whistleblower through Twitter, public speeches, and private speeches. So there's a pretty well-documented list of calls that he's made. One in particular that I think is one to think about tonight. He says, "The press knows who it is. You know who it is. You just don't want to report it. You know you'd be doing a public service." And that public service point, I think, is something that we need to explore and think about what it means to be doing a public service in particular. Interestingly, though, Trump's call for releasing the name of the whistleblower does mirror partisan public sentiment. A recent poll by CBS and YouGov finds that 47% of respondents say that the whistleblower in the case should be forced to be made public, while 53% say the whistleblower should remain anonymous. This falls along party lines as you start to look at the numbers more, with 78% of Republicans and 30% of Democrats saying the whistleblower's name should be made public, while 80% of Democrats and 24% of Republicans say the whistleblower's name should remain private. Polling also reveals the larger public thinking about the motivation of the whistleblower. 38% believe that the release of the whistleblower's point was to release information damaging to Trump politically. 37% believe that they released information to protect the U.S. interest, and 23% aren't sure yet. They're just waiting to see. Maybe the congressional hearings will help that sort of group of folks. Despite all of this, I would argue that the whistleblower should remain anonymous, even though we're seeing the sort of mix in public polling, as a matter of good governance, as it preserves the safety for others to do so in the future. Good governance relies on the ability for career bureaucrats to be able to report where they see issues that are occurring within the federal administration. We have legal protections for them, but in this case, those legal protections aren't necessarily enough. So we'll see what happens in the end with the report of whether or not the whistleblower will remain anonymous. Thank you.
So my name is Taehyun Nam. I will talk about this South Korean case. This whole whole Donald Trump presidency and impeachment, whenever it comes up in a classroom or wherever, in my Brazilian judicial place, a lot of people have all this really high running emotions and all this patriotism and sense of, commitment and all that. And really tense, right? And then people try to figure out what the other people is thinking, is it pro or anti-Trump and blah, blah, blah. Right? So I can kind of feel the air here is also very tense. But guys, relax. We're talking about South Korea, okay? Who cares about South Korea? So don't worry and just relax and enjoy. So I have 7 minutes. I already used about a minute, but I will count 7 minutes from now. So let me sort of walk backwards, right? Meaning that I'd like to talk about today what is going on and sort of guide you backwards to the day of impeachment of South Korea. So I want you to think about something that we don't really necessarily discuss here in the United States, and something that we didn't discuss, well, not we, they, maybe we, I don't know, discuss back in South Korea. So the picture you see are protests over there. It's a central square of South Korea. And I don't know if you can see that, but there are waving flag, a white kind of ish. That's a sort of taegukgi in South Korean. That's a name for national flag. And the one on the top, there's also, they are the participants of the rally, the particular rally. And even though the rally was organized rather very conservative sort of activist, the leader, party leader of Conservative Party, the guy wearing glasses behind the 태극기, and the lady next to him, they're all sort of major party leaders. So it kind of shows the protesters had do have a lot of sort of political influence and sway in the streets of South Korea. So these are the photos that I took while I was doing my field research in South Korea in April. They are all they are the members of the 태극기 troops or 태극기 부대, and they are very conservative. And as I mentioned later on, they are very hardened supporter of former President Park Geun-hye. And these photos were taken in front of the detention center. I went there and sort of hang around with these people, and they demanded, of course, the release of their beloved President Park Geun-hye. As you can notice, these people waving also United States national flag, and then, of course, Israeli flag. Why? Well, you can ask me in the Q&A. So who are these people? Well, they are, as I said, loosely connected and hardened supporter of former President Park Geun-hye. And they are largely old and mostly retired. And they are really sort of a radical voice of South Korea. They don't really have a whole lot of political agenda other than to free Park Geun-hye. And they hate commies, communist, red, but they don't really know what communism is. So it actually, what they hate is like everybody except them, right? North Korean government, South Korean government, mass media, everybody. And they sort of breed on and live on this fake news, and they're now very active on the YouTube channels. And the lady over there, she's sort of giving out free food for the protesters over the day. Their first rally started October 31st, 2016 against a TV company, JTBC, who broke a major story, who reported this. They found a tablet PC where they had all this evidence incriminating the president and her confidante, Choi Soon-sil. According to that, well, let me move on. And then the protest grew to be a weekly protest. Actually, last Saturday, they had a 155th rally. So they are really committed. And now they organize even to a political party. It's known as a patriotism for Great Korea, even though they have one single member in the parliament or National Assembly, rather. They are still really sort of powerful and loud, especially on the street. And I did actually did the things that political scientists do. A lot of people. I counted those protests and blah blah blah. But long story short, these are sort of one of the results showing the active sort of frequency of their weekly protest only in Seoul. So they are for a year. They are really active, right? And then, well, why? Well. In emergency mode. I would argue, and I actually have evidence, these protests were actually a reaction to candlelight protests. I'm not so sure if you are familiar with the candlelight protest, but these are sort of photos showing you the candlelight protest. Each dot shows you a candle that each person held during their protest against Park Geun-hye when she was still president. The two photos actually show you one single protest. So there's a building on the top. So since the angle cannot capture everything, so that person captured here and there. So meaning there were like 2 million people packed that same square that I showed you earlier. So this kind of shows you actually empirically that the 태극기 protest, the first protest that I showed you earlier, were response to this candlelight protest. Why was it respond? Why did it respond? Because this candlelight protest was actually the dominant force of the impeachment. At first, politicians didn't know what to do, even though JTBC reported that President pretty much didn't do anything until 10 in the morning, and after that, she sort of did her hair, and then she just hung around and slept again. So she did nothing while a lot of people were actually dying when a Patty sang and killing 300 people. She was the only citizen in the country who has no idea what was going on. And she said it, really asked a stupid question at 5 p.m. when the Patty sang 8 a.m. So we were all, well, a lot of people in South Korea were stunned to see this president. But anyway, so she was impeached in December by the National Assembly and removed by Constitutional Court. 2 quick notes. The impeachment resolution passed even though there were a significant number of Conservative Party members, and out of 120 party members, 62 voted for the impeachment. The Constitutional Court were filled with conservative judges, and then still they fire her with 8-0. Anyway, Park Geun-hye, so these are sort of charges. She pretty much didn't do anything, and then her confidante raised a lot of funds for her. So now she's behind the bar. So what are the takeaways? Impeachment obviously is a political process. Mobilization is key. Mass mobilization key. Do we need it here in the United States? I don't know. There was a case in South Korea. Since it's a political process, there are always backlash, and South Korea is dealing with that backlash, which nobody thought about before. So let's say if we impeach and fire Donald Trump, what happens then? What happens the day after? Will we go back to the normal? We will be happy all together? I don't know. But at least I think we really have to think about it. Thank you.
All right, it's going to get tense again. Okay. President Trump has called impeachment a coup. Several of President Trump's allies, including House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Utah Representative Chris Stewart, have also attached the coup label to the impeachment process. And a recent headline for a listicle in the New York Post reads, 10 reasons why this impeachment inquiry is really a coup. Republicans in the United States aren't the only ones talking this way. President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela and President Evo Morales of Bolivia have also used that label to describe what's been happening to their governments. Accusing one's opponents of carrying out a coup is a serious charge. Coups kill democracy, install dictatorships, and lead to grave human rights abuses. Just ask Guatemalans, Brazilians, Chileans, and Argentines about the disastrous effects of coups. And even when they target dictators, coups offer little hope of building or restoring democracy. Research has found that coups tend to replace one dictator with another. Given these high stakes, we should carefully evaluate the accusations made by President Trump, Maduro, and Morales that they have been victims of a coup. To do so, we first need to define the term. Scholarship on civil-military relations points to at least 3 elements that have to be present for some action to count as a coup. First, the intent must be the ouster of the person holding executive power, if not also the removal of the executive's political allies. Second, the perpetrators must come from within the state. They might include other civilian leaders, but most often we're talking about the military. After all, the military is usually the only institution capable of forcibly removing the person in charge. And third, the action must be illegal, meaning that it violates constitutional rules. Let's briefly compare the definition of a coup with what's been going on in Venezuela, Bolivia, and the United States. On April 30th of this year, Juan Guaido, the leader of Venezuela's legislature, declared himself the rightful president of the country. He then called on the Venezuelan military to recognize him as such. This would have effectively pushed Maduro out of power. Now consider the elements here. The intent was Maduro's removal, though it didn't end up happening. The perpetrators included rival civilian leaders as well as military defectors. And the legality of this action was dubious at best. It relied on the presumption that Maduro had abandoned his post, which he clearly had not done. Now, this month in Bolivia, after a presidential election marred by accusations of fraud and irregularities, and after weeks of mass protests, the military high command suggested that President Evo Morales resign. It was an offer he really couldn't refuse. Fearing for his life, he fled into exile in Mexico, and as we speak, a new self-appointed president in Bolivia has assumed office and is now overseeing violent repression of protesters and members of Morales' political party. Here again, the intent was removal, as well as persecution of the president's party and supporters. The perpetrators included top-ranking military officers, and the transfer of power has not adhered to constitutional requirements. Bolivia's Congress never accepted Morales' resignation because they knew it was done under duress. And that refusal to accept the resignation calls into question, undermines the legitimacy of his successor. Now we move to the United States. First, many who support Trump's impeachment would certainly like him removed from office. But that is very unlikely to happen given the makeup of the Senate. House Democrats certainly knew that going in. Now, second, while Trump's Democratic opponents are certainly advancing impeachment, the military is thankfully playing no role, taking no side. And third, the Democrats appear to be following the impeachment process explicitly laid out in the Constitution, a process that does allow for removal following conviction in the Senate. So, comparing Trump to Maduro and Morales reveals a stark contrast. Trump is not, in fact, facing a coup. Maduro and Morales, however, do appear to have faced one. In Maduro's case, the coup attempt was unsuccessful. In Morales' case, it looks to have been successful. Now, certainly all three presidents have engaged in troubling behaviors that warrant some kind of response, perhaps even removal from office. But while the response in the United States has involved constitutional checks and balances, the response in Venezuela and Bolivia has involved the military, threats of violence, and actual uses of violence. In my view, the military's role is what most clearly distinguishes a coup from impeachment. Of course, we should remember that an impeachment, like a coup, is a political process, as Dr. O'Loughlin outlined. And as a political process, it might be motivated by political as well as legal considerations. And we should remember that an impeachment like a coup might even represent a cynical power grab. This was the case in Paraguay in 2012, when President Fernando Lugo was impeached and removed from office in just 48 hours without any opportunity to defend himself. It was also the case recently in Brazil when President Dilma Rousseff was impeached on trumped-up charges. But so long as the military stays on the sidelines, preserving space for political conflict to play out peacefully, then impeachment avoids becoming the same thing as a coup. Let me close by noting an irony in Trump's inflammatory rhetoric. In an apparent effort to delegitimize impeachment, he has called it a coup and treated it as a threat to American democracy itself. And yet, at the same time, his administration has emphatically supported the very real coups in Venezuela and Bolivia. In fact, the United States still recognizes Guaido, not Maduro, as Venezuela's actual president. By endorsing military interventions as a way of transferring power to the United States' preferred leaders, Trump joins a long line of American presidents who have sadly undermined democracy in Latin America.
So please line up and ask some questions to us on either microphone.
I have a question, but before I ask the question, I have a comment for Dr. O'Loughlin's presentation. I agree with mostly what you said, but I want to take issue about Alexander Hamilton and his view of the Senate. He's dead, so someone has to speak up for him. And his position was that a appointed Senate would be more likely to impeach a president than an elected Senate. And given the situation in our current Senate, he may not have been wrong, would be my point.
The question, of course, who has the power of appointment?
Well, yeah, it's the state legislatures, that's correct. But his position was that because they were once removed, they would be less influenced by an electoral, by the vote. And there is a good reason why in this country we appoint juries and not elect them. So I think you may have had a valid point, and that actually creating an elected Senate may actually have weakened its ability to act as a jury in an impeachment situation. But my question is, and then getting to Dr. Nam's presentation, what do you think the political implications would be? Because I think it is, I don't know if it's probable, but it is possible that the House of Representatives will vote for impeachment, and that actually a majority of senators, but not enough, will actually agree, and we could have a vote of 51 to 49 for impeachment. I think that that's very possible. What do you think the political outcome would be in that situation? We're entering new territory here.
Well, it's anybody's guess, and my guess will be not any better than anybody's, but no matter how the vote goes, I think the country will be more divided. And the genie that Trump let out, I don't think he will go back to the lamp, right? So rather, I would imagine, using the case of South Korea, my guess would be that the situation in terms of a division between amongst citizens, the problem will be worse, I think, I'm afraid. Right? If you listen to the Trump supporter, really listen, right? Instead of just reading newspapers or watching them on YouTube or TV news. If you really talk to them, it's totally different world. I don't think we can overcome the sort of the divide that easily, especially if we remove Trump.
Mr. Burdett.
Yes, my name is Jake Burdett. I'm the co-president of the Salisbury University College Democrats here, and my question is why do you all think that the Democratic Party, out of all the things that they could have chosen to try to impeach Trump for, I mean, we have brazen violations of the Emoluments Clause by accepting donations from Saudi Arabia through them staying at his hotels and paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so, and then he's clearly doing favors in return by helping arm their ongoing genocide in Yemen. So that is just one example of something that Trump has been doing that is an impeachable offense since day one. So my question is, why did the Democrats wait 3 years to, rather than go after him for emoluments, why would they choose this, in my eyes, a much weaker argument, this thing where they essentially have to defend Joe Biden's son accepting $50,000 a month from a Ukrainian natural gas company? Why do you think that they chose to impeach over that, and they waited all this time to do it, rather than impeach over emoluments or something much more easy to defend?
I'll take a shot. I think, I mean, your point is, I think, well taken. I think the answer, part of the answer has to do with the focus, certainly from Pelosi's leadership, I think, is what will sell best with the American public, with an eye towards, of course, elections coming up. And I mean, what was fascinating here is the Mueller, in my view, and I actually did read the Mueller report, all 400 and some pages, that the impeachment just yells out when you read that report, yet it was pretty clear that Pelosi, the leadership of the Democratic Party, was dragging its feet with regard to that. And without this new affair, we may not have impeachment inquiry at all. So I think it is the pitch. Again, I think I tend to agree with you that the criminal war in Yemen is far worse than anything of these dalliances that Trump has engaged in. But I think that's the answer.
I think also it was timing too, right? I mean, I think the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, reached this sort of boiling point within the mainstream Democratic Party such that, she kind of had to start impeachment hearings, and the timing of this occurring, sort of worked together to sort of marry what she believed she had to do after being pushed, and one of many things that that Trump was doing. So thanks, Jake.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations. My question is directed to Dr. Nam. So one of the pictures you showed were of the conservative protesters having a U.S. flag and then an Israeli flag. And I assume that's because the U.S. is also anti-communist, and you said that they are anti-communist, so they kind of go with that. So my question is, there seems to be a lot of U.S. influence, so I was wondering, when did that start? Did it start during the Korean War period? Do you even think there is U.S. influence? Just elaborate on that. Thank you.
You should take my political science 220 comparative government of East Asia. So my answer is yes, and I don't know how long I can, but the tie between the two countries go way back. Of course, we fought together during the Korean War, but even before that, it was the United States that liberated certain part of Korea from Japanese colonial powers. We created a U.S. military government and ruled that part of the world for 2.5 years, right? And all our dictators since then were favored and protected by CIA. And we also have a legal obligation to protect South Korea. And that dependency creates very interesting political dynamics, many dynamics, including these people sort of waving the American flag. I'm not really so sure CIA is behind it. There's no way in doing it, but politically speaking, United States is their paradise? No, it's like, what is the word for the Christians, the sort of ideal world, right? They have really strong sort of almost religious beliefs that U.S. is like ideal place. They will come and save us. They have saved us from a communist during the Korean War. So while I was doing an interview, people would say, "Oh, blah, blah, blah." And then I kind of show I introduce myself. They were very suspicious toward outsiders, reporters, right? But as soon as I show my business card, right, written in English, and I introduce myself, "Oh, I teach politics from the United States." And oh yeah, and then they kind of open up, and then usually they kind of close their answers by saying, "Oh, please ask President Trump to release President Park." I'm like, "Okay, I will try." Right? So there is that sort of really sort of a political really connection that they do make in their mind. But if we look at the history, actually, United States has shaped not only the politics, but a lot of even the very mindset of people and perception of the world. And you are directly watching the sort of result of that influence in front of your eyes.
Thank you so much.
Hello. So my name is Bryce Sanborn, and this is just going to whoever can answer this. But in the possibility that President Trump does get impeached, would he be able to run again in the next election or in any other elections afterwards, or no?
If he were impeached and expelled from office, then no. Because as I stated within the Constitution itself, banishment from the honor of holding an office, a federal office. So, but short of conviction, the answer is yes.
Right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Becker from the Department of Psychology, which is really irrelevant tonight. But as far as my question goes, so I'm hearing the version of the news that I get from the New York Times and the Washington Post daily. But clearly, 40% of the country is not hearing that message. I'm sure there are people in this room who voted for Donald Trump. How could we establish a dialogue and bring them into the conversation? Because what I was hearing, I would be really uncomfortable admitting I was a Trump voter in this room. So what could you say to those people who are on the other side today?
I would say, especially over the next couple of weeks, I mean, don't turn on Fox, don't turn on MSNBC. I mean, watch C-SPAN, watch the hearings. I mean, judge for yourself. Try to get as many sort of facts as you possibly can, so you can, in a most unbiased way possible, judge for yourself as to the veracity of what the Democrats are claiming and charging. So that would be one thing. Anybody else?
I would just say, I think that's right, that the focus has to be on what are the facts. I mean, what I think the problem of Trump and Trumpism is that it has entered into a world where facts don't matter, and where disinformation becomes sort of the dollar of the day for a lot of Trump supporters. Mm-hmm. And that's the difficulty we face. But I think Adam's right, that if we focus on what are the facts of the matter and follow that, then a dialogue could engage. But it's difficult. I mean, that's one of the problems we have. The polarization is a very difficult problem we face.
But I mean, with the internet, I mean, it does sort of make it easier. I mean, if you're a Trump supporter and you're watching Fox News and you hear Sean Hannity say something about, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is a never-Trumper and what he said was X, Y, and Z, I mean, it's fairly easy to pull out your phone, go to PolitiFact, go to an unbiased news source and look for exactly what Vindman said. And that way you can make the decision as to whether or not Sean Hannity's interpretation of the hearings is accurate or not. But again, it's a time thing, right? Do people actually have the time to engage like that? And a lot of people don't, we realize, so.
I think one other thing to consider is that this is an inherently political process in terms of thinking about impeachment. So it's not like a regular trial. So one of the things that I didn't talk about tonight was this idea of the Sixth Amendment and having the right to meet your accuser in terms of the whistleblower. That doesn't apply in this sort of case because it's not a criminal case. It's also, we could see it as pre-trial going on too. It's not even like falling into the realm of what that might look like. So I think the considerations of thinking through this, and as you look at the polling, it is inherently partisan because it is inherently a political process that is lacking some detail in other sorts of spaces. And so, it's important to be able to watch what's going on, but with partisan divides as we have them, we see that this is political rather than this sort of like straightforward kind of criminal case that could go on, and thinking about the verdict.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's James, and I am a student here for the older student, but I am a student here in political science, about to get my degree here soon. But I do want to ask a couple questions. One is, I wanted to comment first about Trump supporters. I mingle with a lot of Trump supporters. I'm a veteran, so veterans tend to be Trump supporters. So I talk to Trump supporters all the time. I kind of understand how they think and why they think the way they do. But for an example, today I was on Twitter, scrolling down Twitter, and I follow all the journalists on Twitter, and they were attacking Nunes, Representative Nunes today, like how horrible person he is. So I go on to Facebook, and one of my veteran friends posted, "Go Nunes, go." I mean, that's kind of the things that's going on right now, and there is a divide in the country right now. And the Trump supporters really feel like if they're in here listening, they're probably thinking there's a bunch of liberals criticizing Trump. I'm sure that's what they're thinking right now, and that's kind of the way it is. And they're getting their news from sources that aren't reporting kind of some of the things that you talked about today. But one thing that I don't understand, I know why the Republicans are doing what they're doing. They're trying to gin up support for the elections coming up next year. They think by going after the whistleblower and all those people, they're going to gin up support. But I can't understand why the whistleblower's testimony has been corroborated by so many people after that. And today, I was listening to someone on the radio, and they want to out that whistleblower so bad, and I just cannot comprehend what political strategy goes into outing that whistleblower. So I know, Dr. Surak, you had talked about it. I mean, what do you think about that, and why do you think they are so desperate to out this whistleblower?
Yeah, it's a turn in focus from the content to the process as a way of focusing not on what's been said, which, as you've mentioned, is even in the letter had already been corroborated by the time it was submitted, but instead focusing on, is the procedure fair? And it is, if you look through kind of the legal steps that have to be taken, so it is fair in that end. But I do think that it's a way to think towards process rather than content, because it's very difficult to argue with the content of the letter that's there.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jared Galley. I'm a freshman. I'm in Dr. Snam's political science class. And I was wondering, so Dr. Nam said that we would see more of a divide if hypothetically the impeachment went through and President Trump was impeached. How do we stop that divide? What can we do to help bridge people together even after a very dividing moment like impeachment?
It's well, I will share my 2 cents. Maybe it is weird to hear that from a person who was not born here in this country, but well, let me share my brief experience. So I came here back in 1996 as a student, right, graduate student, and I studied all my life. Anyway, right? And then did my master's here, PhD here. I taught in one college, and I've been teaching here for many years. In other words, I've been in a bubble of sort of like liberal, sort of intellectuals, people who actually read the books, right? And then I started to, I've been doing a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for many years. And then there, everybody is like Trump supporter. I didn't know, but back in the day, right, the day before the election, they kind of I don't know, came out and they showed their real true face, right? They're not talking about all this Trump and where they can buy bullets, where it's on sale, and so it was kind of shocking to me. And they all knew that I'm teaching political science. They asked me, are you liberal? I said, no, I'm communist. And we're kind of joking around. And I don't know if you know the jiu-jitsu, but you choke and you break arms and twist your knees and all that. In other words, you cannot really do it and train without an absolute trust to other person. And I do have absolute trust to these Trump supporters. And they do love me too, right? So, so occasionally we can speak, and they listen to me. So long story short, I think what we really need is thinking about rather than how do we overcome this political divide, but the question is how do we reconstruct a society, a neighborhood, and where can we meet people and hang around and really bump into each other and establish sort of sense of a community again. Yeah. I think only then we can talk about political sort of divide, I think.
Yeah, I'd like just to build on Dr. Nam's point. In defense of divides, politics is about divides. Right? It's unavoidable. And I'm a big fan of a political philosopher, Chantal Mouffe, who makes this point that once the appearance of a kind of cohesion and uniformity is it's the denial of politics. So I think we should accept that there are going to be divides. But as Dr. Nam explained, it's all about establishing the legitimacy of your opponent. Not agreeing with your opponent, but establishing the right of your opponent to exist. So it's never about reaching a consensus. Consensus is impossible, but it's about learning how to manage the game of politics, to understand our relationship with our opponents, understanding that we're never going to reach some definitive final end point, that the conflict goes on.
Well, let me disagree just a bit.
I always have to have this disagreement.
I think that I agree with Eric that divides are natural part of the political arena. But there has to be some, in effect, consensus about a legitimate form of the polity, so that what we're struggling to do, and I think you were making the connection with the coup versus the impeachment, we're saying, no, we should have some agreement as to what impeachment is, and that it's a legitimate process and a legitimate structure and process. But that requires not necessarily consensus, I would agree, but a very strong majority support for it. And the threat we're under presently, and this is why I think, as I had critique of the Republican Party, the Republican Party is undermining the very credibility of the legitimacy of our institutions and our impeachment process. So when you listen to these hearings, and this is some of the discussion with people who have supported Trump, the question has to be put, do you believe in facts? Do you believe in legitimate processes or not? And this is why I think that the problem, it really is the threat of Trumpism is a threat of fascism, because fascism, the fascist momentum, the fascist character of movements is a denial of legitimacy of any institutions. It's a faith in force and physical power, physical military and ultimately violence as well. So I think that's where we are. That's the struggle we have, I think, presently.
Thank you all. Hi, I'm Andrew Wilson. I'm a freshman here at SU. I'm in Dr. Hoffman, the Ansarok's class. My question was off of your point, Dr. Nam, about protesters in South Korea. I know that a lot of us, including myself, write off the possibility of conviction if and when Trump is impeached by the House. Do you believe, or I guess anyone, do you believe that if Americans gather together like the South Korean protesters did, that they'll be able to flip those conservative views in the Senate like the protesters did in South Korea if they gather in the same way and protest in the same limelight?
So you're kind of asking me to guess. And my honest answer is, I don't know. But it's different, right? I mean, first of all, South Korea is a really small country compared to the United States. A nation, when people say 2 million people pack capital city, it really reverberates, resonates entire country. If we have 2 million people pack Washington, D.C., sure, it's a big event, but its impact is much smaller. Well, what if we mobilize, I don't know, 100 million people? I guess that would be great, but it's impossible. But having said that, it will certainly persuade a lot of people, especially if you are from a senator from, I don't know, like New Hampshire or where you kind of on the line, right? And then you loudly hear this really strong, convicted voice against Trump, then it could potentially do something. But of course, we don't know. So I guess citizens have to do what they can do, even though they really not. There's no way knowing the impact of their individual behavior. That's the ultimate irony of any collective behavior.
So just to add to that, I'll throw some numbers at you. I mean, it's unlikely, that you're going to move 20 Republican senators. Democrats, they might be able to get, 5, 10, 15 or something like that. The latest poll for Morning Consult this morning, after, a number of the witnesses testified, show support of the country, the entire country, 48% agree that Trump should be impeached to 44. So that number's significant, but you still see, you know, incredible divide as people talked about. You know, Democrats, about 85% of Democrats support impeachment, about 40% of independents, and of course about 10% of Republicans. So, you know, if those numbers for independents and Republicans go up over the course of the next few weeks as we learn more about what witnesses testified to, other issues come up not even relating to this Ukraine issue, that Trump lied. What was the latest charge? Can't remember. Something else that he lied about. So, you know, as more gets revealed, and if that needle moves in a couple of key sort of purplish states that Dr. Nam was talking about, like Arizona, like Maine, then, you know, there's the possibility that they get closer to that magic number of 20. But it's a tremendous long shot. So.
Thank you.
I'm Melissa. To my understanding, no American president has been removed from office through the process of impeachment. If this does happen and he is removed, aren't we kind of in uncharted waters? I mean, Hamilton probably didn't think of everything.
I would just say, I think it would be a positive thing, because we're in the era of really the presidential government and imperial presidency, I think, and the legislature, the Congress, has suffered, partly by its own fault, but certainly has suffered in terms of the balance of power. And the impeachment, I compared the impeachment, the impeachment power with the veto power, in a sense. That's really the threat of the veto that allows a president to have influence over policymaking with the Congress. Well, the threat of impeachment ought to be forcing presidents and executives to behave themselves and to operate within the law. And instead, what we have, and Trump is simply the most flagrant case, I think, but he clearly doesn't feel any threat, ultimately, from the impeachment process, and really is a rogue president. I mean, he does pretty much what he wants to do, doesn't hand over his taxes, says that he's actually uninvestigatable, right, and the like, believing and having a plausible case where he could survive this process and win re-election. I mean, that is a very plausible scenario. Donald Trump could win a second term. And that will show further that the impeachment power is toothless. It's a paper tiger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good evening. I had a question about the process. So when the impeachment inquiry began and the House voted on the rules of the impeachment inquiry, they put in a stipulation where instead of going to the Judiciary Committee, the inquiry was in the Intel Committee, and therefore chaired by Adam Schiff. Also, they stipulated that all witnesses must be approved by Adam Schiff, which is unprecedented because it is a right which has been afforded to every president who's had an impeachment inquiry, Johnson, Nixon, Clinton. I was just wondering, how do you think you can reconcile with the evidence that's up here? I mean, it seems like a pretty black and white case that you've laid out. Why would you stipulate that? Why would the Democrats stipulate that only witnesses that can be approved by Adam Schiff, who has, let's be honest, a vested interest? He's been the most proponent supporter in the House, aside from maybe Maxine Waters, for impeachment of the president. Why, A, Adam Schiff has been put in charge, and why they've stipulated that the witnesses have to be approved by the chairman?
I think a couple of reasons. So Congress, the House particularly, is a majoritarian institution. So, you know, as you probably know, who's ever in the majority controls the process at so many different levels. when it comes to introducing bills, when it comes to voting, when it comes to setting the rules on how things are debated. Similarly, when it comes to the impeachment process, of course, the Constitution gives, very little direction of, exactly the procedure. If in the Constitution it said something to the effect of both parties, need to have the ability to call witnesses and so forth. But because it doesn't give much direction, and because the Democrats are in control of the House, like so many things, they could pretty much do what they want to control this particular process. I think that's the first reason. I think that the second reason is, if they allowed the Republican members of Congress to call witnesses, I think they would be afraid that they would call, Hunter Biden. They'd try to call the whistleblower, and more from sort of a political process of wanting to win. As you said, obviously, Adam Schiff and other Democrats, want to win this fight, basically. And so I think part of it is political. And I think part of it is that's the way the Constitution has been set, basically. So,
quick follow-up. Do you think that calls into question maybe a little bit of fairness? I mean, it kind of, in the country, we have due process where everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. I mean, shouldn't all presidents be impeached in equal standing, in an equal process? I mean, it's not equal.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when one party wins control of a body, yeah, you're right. It is not equal, right? And when, if Republicans are in control, they set the rules, and if the Democrats are in control, they set the rules. So,
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties is that when we think about impeachment, how we tend to think about it is how we understand the legal criminal code system. And this is an inherently political process and has fairly little precedent in terms of thinking about the types of rules that go forward. And so I think sometimes the equating of the two, of this with a criminal process, kind of confuses the question of what's actually the political process that goes forward.
And it just one more thing. I mean, it does also, this whole process should also help remind people how important voting is, right? In other words, if you're a Democrat and you want to see Trump impeached, you're wishing that last election the Senate would have elected enough Democrats to the Senate to do this. Similarly, if you're a Republican, you wish that the Republican Party, that your party did not lose the House, right? So elections and voting are essential to this process, right? Knowing how it works.
Hi, okay, so I guess my question is kind of like hypothetical, and I guess it's going to anybody. With, I guess, the political divide that's in America now, and with 2020 being an election year, I wanted to know, in the event that Trump got impeached, what would that do for, directly for the Democratic candidates as well as the Republican candidates that kind of aren't getting airtime, because in this present moment Trump is the running mate for the Republicans. So yeah, that's my question.
Are there Republican candidates?
We hosted one on campus in June through PACE.
Yeah. Okay. Good question, Mike.
I'll take quickly. I think that the two scenarios, I think, possibly here. One scenario is an impeachment, and let's assume that it's impeachment without conviction. Yep, because Trump remains in office. One scenario is that will influence independents, principally, people who are on the fence, and will influence them to vote Democratic. Under those circumstances, the dynamic then is Democrats will be fired up even more that Trump got impeached, but the independents move in the Democratic direction, and so the outcome would be a Democrat would get elected president. The other dynamic, however, which is also plausible, I think, is that the impeachment fires up Trump's base and draws out more of that base than was the case that came out in 2016. And under that scenario, it's plausible that Trump could get reelected. He could thread the needle once again, as he did in 2016. So hence, I think that this is one of the reasons why there was such debate within the Democratic Party, and why I think Nancy Pelosi, who's been, I think, a very strong leader for the Democratic Party, was hesitant about this impeachment process because she fears the second scenario. But I think with the Ukraine affair, she really only had no choice. I think Adam's right that the base of the Democratic Party has been really fired up to press her forward on that. So the bet now is we can try to energize this dynamic that will bring over independents more into the Democratic fold.
Because they are actually moving, that's the one needle that's moving in favor of the Trump impeachment, are independents. So it's a pretty good prediction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Michael. I'm a senior at Salisbury University. My major is history, despite being here, but my minor is in political science as well as philosophy. I am taking Dr. Nam's course in international relations, and I greatly enjoy him and his lectures. I find him to be very entertaining. But I just want to have a few comments after watching this panel. I've definitely been taking notes. It's a very good panel, and I am very thankful for having the Political Science Department host this panel, as it's been both very educational and informative. However, as a history major, I want to give a bit of a quick history lesson. I do find this impeachment situation to be awfully familiar to a similar incident 20 years ago with the impeachment inquiry of former President Bill Clinton. President Clinton was impeached for lying under oath while questioned about his affair with Monica Lewinsky, as well as obstruction of justice of a lawsuit coming from Paula Jones. The Republicans, in their infinite wisdom and opportunism, jumped to the opportunity of impeaching President Clinton. And despite having a majority in both houses of Congress, Republicans failed to gather enough votes in the Senate to have impeachment. They were the ones who tampered in what was, in essence, a personal affair between President Clinton and his former aides. The 2000 election resulted in Republicans barely winning the presidency with some luck in Florida and at the Supreme Court. Now, my question to the panel is this. Given that we have moderates, such as Representative Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey and some of his colleagues within the Democratic Party who are skeptical of the impeachment success and worry about the Democrats standing come 2020, as well as the current ideological civil war happening between the neoliberal leadership and the rising star progressives within the Democratic National Committee, as well as polling data which shows no real major shift in either direction in favorability or disapproval of the impeachment, how can this impeachment attempt not be nothing more but what we call kabuki theater, a facade to divert attention from poor candidates who opposed President Trump in 2020? There is a certainty, a guarantee, mind you, that the president will use these impeachment inquiries as a rallying cry to unite Republicans and sway independents, as he will label Democrats as partisans who just won't accept their 2016 loss. How can this not backfire in front of the Democrats and their hopefuls running for Congress and the presidency running for 2020?
Well, I agree with those who say that regardless of the outcome of the 2020 election, it's important for the House to go forward with impeachment because institutional power is built on the credibility of the powers that they have. And if the House were to fail to go through with impeachment in the light of the flagrant violation of abuse of power and violation of law itself, what happens to the Congress's threat to be a credible, balancing institution of the presidency? I mean, let alone be the most important institution. So I think that the Congress has an obligation, the House has an obligation to go forward. So I applaud what they're doing presently. The second point I think we already really responded to, and I think it's a highly debatable question as to whether or not this is going to bring about that first scenario that I suggested, because I think that's what you're speaking to, is that Trump, clearly, yeah, Trump and the Republicans are already doing that, of course. They're trying their best to do that. And the question will be, what is going to be most persuasive for the American public? So the electorate has to make some decisions here, and so a lot is at stake, I think.
And there's so many factors that impact how the electorate makes those decisions. For one thing, campaigns. I mean, political science research shows that campaigns matter. Who runs a better campaign, whose campaign is better funded, who has the most persuasive message. Obviously, the other factors you're probably familiar with, like the state of the economy, likability or dislikability of candidates. So, there's a whole bunch of other factors, even, beyond or besides what we're talking about today, that are going to impact how the electorate behaves in 2020. This is one of them, and it's a big one, but other things are involved too. Thank you, and one more question.
Thank you for your time.
Sure.
Sure.
Last one. So I'm Patrick, and I was actually not born here. I'm not American. I'm from Hong Kong. Therefore, I think I do kind of provide a different kind of outlook on this entire problem. Because personally, I look at the impeachment and I'm like, what's the point? He had 1 year left in office. So let's say he does get impeached. There's his vice president, which I believe to not really be better than Trump. But as like a foreigner not from America, I look at this, I'm like, so if he does get impeached, we see America's democratic power at show again. Like, hey, we the people got him out of, maybe not we the people, we got him out of office. But what is the implication of this on the international scene? Like, will we see a change in the world stage? Because in my opinion, right now the world is perhaps under one of the most not stabilized stages after the Second World War, perhaps because Cold War is actually quite stabilized in my opinion. So will we see a change in the world given that there is suddenly this change in leadership in one of the most powerful states in the world, such as, will China take this opportunity to move forward its agenda in South China Sea and in perhaps Hong Kong? So that's my question.
Let's see.
Well, let me just say this. I'm going to echo Dr. O'Loughlin's point about the importance of the legislature exercising its muscle. So when we look at countries around the world that are undergoing democratic backsliding right now, that are moving from democracy to dictatorship, they're doing so not because Congress is too powerful, but because the executive is too powerful, because the president is too powerful, because there's a concentration of power in the executive. So I totally agree with my colleagues here that in order for our institutions to work, they have to sometimes be activated. And we're really talking about here the future of American democracy, right? There are concerns that democratic backsliding is happening right now in this country. And so we're kind of witnessing this unfold in real time. And in order to stem that democratic backsliding, I think the legislature using its constitutional prerogatives to check the power of the executive is what is necessary. I don't know. On the point of how this will change geopolitics, I don't think it will. I mean, if there were somehow a change in leadership, the regime would stay the same, the party would stay the same, the U.S. military would stay the same. So I don't think it would necessarily invite aggressive acts on the part of geopolitical rivals.
But my point is that since Trump is kind of unprecedented president, right there. So since most other countries typically they kind of have their own plan because they analyze the personality of other foreign leaders and kind of make their own agenda based on that analyze. But since Trump is such a not radical person, so and if the sudden switches, does that mean other countries' plans and agendas and their way of thinking how America would act would change as well? So that's kind of my thought. Because now we have a change in leadership in America, but that also means that we're making all other countries, most other countries analyze off America off point. So does that mean that they may make the wrong decision at times.
I'll get real quick. If we were successful, let's assume we actually could expel this president from office. Well, then that would be a model, wouldn't it? That could send a message to other countries that, well, look, actually, with a strong legislature, executives can be held accountable. So if the United States can do that, perhaps we can do that as well. If I catch your drift, that's what you're suggesting. So it could be modeled, but that's not necessarily. I agree with Eric. That's not going to necessarily happen, but.
Yeah, and I think that the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy has been chaotic and has sent mixed signals to allies and foes alike. And so if there were somebody else in power, even if it is Vice President Pence, it might introduce a degree of stability. We may not like the stable policies that are enacted, but it might be more in line with conventional Republican orthodoxy on foreign policy.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.